and I would like to introduce Dr. Mark Lohmann. Dr. Mark Lohmann is from the Federal Institute for Risk Assessment. His scientific background is biochemistry and bioinformatics, and his research now is focusing on the realization of target group-orientated risk communication and the development of methods to determine the influence of socio-psychological factors on public risk perception. Please.
Yeah, thanks very much for the introduction and for giving me the opportunity to present the development steps of the BfR-Risk Profile, which is a graphical tool that illustrates the magnitude of substantial risk assessment parameters. And this profile has been developed for use in risk communication. And in general, risk communication has two major objectives. On the one hand, it has to increase the level of knowledge with respect to a certain risk topic and to improve also the intelligibility of scientific findings. On the other hand, it has to promote the dialogue with various stakeholder groups and the public in order to avoid misjudgment or to reduce the potential for conflicts. And as a consequence, all the risk communication measurements can be divided into one-way communication without having any feedback mechanism and two-way communication or so-called participatory measurements. And especially for one-way communication, it's a big challenge to inform a target group or a broad public comprehensively about the risk characteristics without knowing their level of knowledge, their information needs and their information requirements, as well as their subjective risk perception. And that's why there's a big or strong demand at the moment on visualization tools that provide the reader of a risk message with a quick and intuitive access to the major outcomes of the risk assessment process. So commonly, the information about the hazardous potential and the dose-effect relationship and exposure assessment are published in form of official opinion. And this figure here shows you an example of a BfR opinion, which has always the same structure. So background information are provided, a justification is given why risk assessment was necessary, the used analytical methods are described in a detailed form, the results, and of course the recommendations for action. And such opinion may have 50 to 60 pages, and not everyone is willing to read all the details, and that's why we sum up all the major facts in a gray box, which represents always the first page of an opinion. So in 2010, we conducted a comprehensive evaluation on our opinions, and we asked 200 consumers under laboratory conditions in a 60-minute interview to assess several BfR opinions. And as an outcome, one can say that some parts of the opinion are understandable for the consumer. Especially the gray box seems to have an added value for understanding. And another finding was that here 78% of the consumers stated that they have learned something new about the topic. Of course, it's not the major intention of an opinion. Moreover, it should help people to better deal with the risk, that they receive useful information for everyday life, or at least they should be well informed after reading such an opinion. But here, an average 50 to 60% stated that this goal is achieved. And the results of this evaluation led to the initiation of the project BfR-Risk Profile. And first of all, we conducted intensive literature research on existing risk profiles and visualization tools. There exist some risk profiles, however, they cannot be easily transferred to all aspects in risk assessment which are covered by BfR, so they are not applicable for a risk assessment process in food and product safety, for example. And as a major outcome of literature research, we developed several risk profile prototypes, and we gave them into an internal evaluation process as well as an external evaluation here with members from ministries, authorities involved in food and product safety, as well as with scientists. And the results were then used to build up a new risk profile, and after a trial period of 2 years, we conducted focus groups with representatives of our stakeholder groups, and this contains, of course, also here the general public. Yeah, literature review reveals that there exist several visualization tools. A very common type is the so-called risk matrix, and this risk matrix defines various levels of risk by the product of likelihood and severity categories. And so it's a very simple mechanism to increase the visibility of a risk and to assist risk management decision making. However, it combines only 2 parameters, and this is absolutely insufficient to represent a whole degree of risk potential exhaustively. However, this risk matrix uses a traffic light system, and this is can be also found on several food products, for example, to show how much sugar, fat, or saturated fats are in the food. And the results of many surveys show that this green amber red light indication is very welcomed by the consumer to illustrate risk potentials. And it appeared to us that the illustration of the results of a product test, they could a highly efficient visualization model, because here many parameters are utilized and combined to form an overall result. And indeed, this model served as a template for the final risk profile. Then there exist many visualization tools that try to illustrate the probability of risk, for example, the individual risk here for certain diseases compared to an average risk, or in the way that, for example, 5 out of 10,000 people will be affected by a risk. Normally, a risk assessment cannot deliver such probabilities. So a probability in risk assessment is more or less an estimation, which is based on findings to which a degree, a certain limit value is exhausted. And a risk assessor is not able to announce probabilities in the way that 5 people out of 10,000 will be affected by the risk. But nevertheless, such probability terminologies are used, and the question is how to define these terminologies. And that's why we analyzed several studies which made the attempt to transfer verbal probability information onto numerical scales. And the study here we had 238 science writers from USA and Canada were asked to transform 52 verbal probability information onto a percentage scale. Represents all studies we found in this area. And as a summary, one can say that this transformation is nearly impossible. It succeeds sometimes with the terminology always or impossible and never. Here the range of answers is very low, but it is quite impossible for possible or might happen. Here the range of a numerical assessment is too high, and this is also the case for many other verbal probability informations. And as a consequence, there seems no other solution to define its own understanding of these probability terminologies, to write it down in a guidance document in order to make it comparable and transparent. So this slide shows you the first prototype, which we gave into an internal evaluation on a 5-point scale. We illustrated here the magnitude of 5 different parameters. So the distribution from single person to total population, probability and severity of damage, validity of available data to underpin the uncertainty of the whole risk assessment process, and the trend in risk perception. Here it was the aim to compare the scientific interpretation of the assessment results with public's risk perception. In many cases it differs strongly, and the results we received here from representative population surveys. Then explanation here is given concerning the single magnitudes, and the target group is highlighted by this presentation here. So, for example, pregnant women. Then prototype number 2 and 3 differ in their graphical presentation without giving any information about the magnitudes, and especially prototype number 3 foregrounds the target group more boldly. And so these prototypes were given into the internal evaluation process where risk assessors, risk communicators took part. And it was a result that a risk profile should be more factual and unemotional. Because here we had developed another prototype where we exaggerated, here's a highlighting of the target group, and here the result was to reduce this emotional aspect, and that's why we developed another one. It's called the slider model. It's very factual. So we have, again, this parameters distribution, probability, severity of damage. We had also here the information whether the severity of damage is irreversible or not. Then validity of available data, and we replaced the parameter risk perception by controllability by the consumer. It was regarded as more effective for the consumer to have an overview about the control measurements. Then we wanted to highlight, of course, the corresponding target groups by icon, but this was another project. It was not so easy. For example, here this icon should represent pregnant women. And when you sit in the back, maybe there could something also wrong with the stomach or confusion with the digestive system. This symbol here should highlight children. The outcome was that it reflects only infants, and this is the official symbol for the changing room. And here, this icon should represent the elderly people, and active seniors do not feel addressed or even feel offended was the outcome of the evaluation. We developed another alternative, it's a matrix model, and here we have again these categories, probability, severity of health impairment, divided here for the two different target groups for children and whole population, and we add additional information about the validity of available data and controllability by the consumer. However, this matrix model was regarded as too complex because it represents here two different visualization methods, and that's why we optimize the slider model. And this figure shows the risk profile which is currently in use on a concrete example, a cleaning product with nitric acid concentration of 20 to 30%. So a very high acid concentration. When you use it, you have nothing to clean anymore. And the corresponding product was removed from the market. Again, we have here the affected group, and these are icons able to illustrate the target groups, the whole population, pregnant women, children, elderly people, and people with a disease. Then probability of health, severity of health impairment. Here it's referred to a concrete exposure scenario, and the validity of available data reduced to 3 magnitudes, high, medium, and low, and controllability by the consumer. And this category is a gray zone between risk assessment and risk management. So for example, when controllable through avoidance is highlighted, then it may have an effect on the market. It may have an economical effect. And so we had to add some additional information that this category is meant as a descriptive character. It's a logical consequence of the risk assessment process, and it's not a recommendation given by the BfR to avoid a product or to buy a product. So, and finally, we conducted focus group interviews with our stakeholder groups, and here the results reveal that in average 20 to 25% of the experts groups here considered the risk profile as usable for their daily work. In contrast, 60% of the general population stated that this is a helpful instrument. However, it seems that we have to improve the understandability of the profile. With the exception of representatives of industry associations, around 30% of all the groups stated that the profile is understandable. However, it's of course not a representative survey, but it gives a first hint. A focus group interview reveals more detailed information. So, for example, that the traffic light system is preferred. This comes from the consumer. Experts say that it's useless to define the risk characteristic, and there was a concrete demand on, for example, quantity recommendation or especially information on affected groups and products. This sometimes stand in conflict with the remit of an independent risk assessment institute. And there was also demand for concrete description on the expected health impairment. This stands against the original intention to illustrate risk at a glance. But nevertheless, the BfR risk profile is regarded as a clearly arranged tool. For the general population, it seems to be very helpful. Experts does not see a concrete use. It's at least suitable to decide whether to read the statement or not. But all the groups want to have more specification. And for all groups, it's quite clear that the risk profile is a compromise between the demands coming from the consumer, for example, to illustrate everything in form of red amber light indications, the demand of the risk assessors. They want to have more categories and they want to have more, to add more nodes. And of course, the risk profile should fit into the production line of the opinion and not to open an extra approval line, which costs several times then. So this is, of course, a compromise for this standardized model. And then we try to renew this profile and publish it hopefully in spring 2016. Thank you very much for your attention.